Welcome to Dr. Conjuring's bone-chilling horror stories, where the terror feels too real to be fiction. Before we dive into tonight's story, make sure to grab your headphones. Trust me, you'll want the full experience. These stories are designed to be felt, not just heard, and the darkness is best experienced with your eyes closed. We don't always need a screen to frighten you. Sometimes it's just the sound that creeps under your skin. So sit back, close your eyes, and let the horror take hold. Now, let's begin. This is a true story that happened one rainy night in October 1987 in the quiet streets of Amsterdam. The rain was heavy, falling so hard it drowned out every sound, except for the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Most people stayed inside, curtains drawn, lights off, like they knew something was coming. But not Sophie. She was a 28-year-old historian, always chasing stories from the past. She had heard about an old shop tucked away in the city, a place full of strange antiques that supposedly had their own dark histories. Sophie was curious, too curious, some might say, and decided to see it for herself. The shop was called the Timekeeper's Curiosities, and when she found it, it looked almost like it didn't belong there. The windows were dusty, and the sign above the door was so faded you could barely read it. Something about the place gave her chills, but she went inside anyway. What Sophie found was a strange old mirror with carvings around the frame, carvings of snakes and symbols she didn't recognize. The shopkeeper warned her that this mirror wasn't like others. He said it had a way of showing people things they weren't ready to see. Sophie laughed it off. That night, alone in her study, she stared into the mirror. And when the reflection moved on its own, she realized what she saw staring back wasn't her reflection. Before we dive into the full story, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss a new horror story. And let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I'd love to see how far these tales travel. Now let's dive right into the story. The night was thick with rain, and the streets of Amsterdam felt oddly deserted. Sophie, the young historian, had always been drawn to stories buried in the past, secrets that the city whispered only to those brave enough to listen. Tonight, her curiosity had led her to the Timekeeper's Curiosities, a shop hidden deep within the maze of Amsterdam's winding alleyways. The city, usually alive with the hum of cyclists, tourists, and locals, had fallen eerily quiet. The only sound that cut through the air was the incessant drumming of the rain against the cobblestones. Sophie didn't mind the weather. In fact, it was perfect. It felt like the kind of night that would hold a secret, one worth uncovering. The shopkeeper, Elias van der Meer, was an enigma in himself. His voice gravelly, his eyes distant, as if he had seen too much of the world's dark side. When he greeted Sophie, he spoke of a mirror, a peculiar one. It was not just a reflection of the present, but a gateway to the past. A gateway that could show its viewer something darker. You should leave it alone, he'd warned, his voice dropping to a whisper. Not all history is meant to be uncovered. Some doors should remain closed. But Sophie was never one to turn back from a mystery. She was a historian, someone who needed to know. She had to know. And so she purchased the mirror, the looking glass of lost souls. Back in her study, Sophie placed the mirror carefully on her desk. The faint creaking of the frame seemed to whisper a warning. She laughed it off, just the old wood settling surely. But the weight of the air in the room felt different now, oppressive. The rain outside intensified, the rhythm of the drops on the window almost matching the frantic beating of her heart. She felt a strange pull to the mirror, an invisible force drawing her in, urging her to gaze deeper. Sophie leaned closer, her breath fogging up the glass. The reflection was faint at first, nothing more than a dull image of the room behind her, distorted by the age of the mirror's surface. But then, something changed. The reflection began to shift. It wasn't just the usual distortion of old glass. There was something in the way the shadows moved. They weren't right. Sophie blinked, her eyes adjusting to the sudden darkness of the room. But the shadows didn't belong to her. They didn't match the real world at all. And then the figure appeared. At first it was just a silhouette, standing behind her, faint and misty. Sophie's pulse quickened. She turned around quickly. Nothing. The room was empty. She looked back into the mirror. The figure was still there. It was a woman, pale with hollow eyes, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The woman's eyes seemed to follow her every movement, as though she could see Sophie as clearly as Sophie could see her. With every passing second, the figure in the mirror grew clearer, more solid. The room around Sophie seemed to darken, and the air grew colder, too cold for such a warm autumn night. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, like it was counting down to something inevitable. Sophie swallowed hard, her throat dry. The woman in the mirror reached forward, her fingers long and unnaturally thin, stretching toward Sophie. The chill from the mirror crept into Sophie's bones, making her shiver. She tried to move away, but her feet felt heavy, as though the floor had turned to stone. The woman's grin widened. "You should not have come here, Sophie. You should not have looked." Sophie's eyes widened, her heart hammering in her chest. She stumbled backward, the cold air biting at her skin. Her hands shook as she reached for the door, desperate to escape. But the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, rattling the windows. She was trapped. The walls seemed to close in on her, the shadows stretching further, blending with the darkness of the mirror. The figure in the glass was no longer distant. It was right there, inches from her face. Sophie's breath came in ragged gasps. Her skin crawled, every instinct screaming at her to run, to leave this cursed room. But she couldn't move. The mirror had her. She was drawn into its depths, her body rooted to the spot. The woman's eyes were burning into hers, hollow and dark, as if she had been staring into Sophie's soul for eternity. "The past does not forget," the voice echoed, now more menacing, more insistent. "It does not forgive." Sophie screamed, but no sound came from her mouth. The figure in the mirror reached out, its cold, bony fingers brushing against her cheek. Sophie gasped as the icy touch sent a jolt of fear straight to her heart. The mirror seemed to ripple, the glass warping as though it were made of liquid. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the figure stepped forward. But it didn't just step forward, it stepped through the glass. The world around Sophie shattered into fragments of cold, sharp light, and for a moment she felt as if she were falling into the depths of the mirror, into a void that consumed everything in its path. She cried out, but her voice was swallowed by the dark. She awoke in a cold sweat on the floor of her study. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The mirror stood there before her, calm once more. Its glass reflected only the room, not the twisted figure that had so recently haunted her. But something was wrong. The air still felt heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. Sophie shakily pushed herself up from the floor, her eyes never leaving the mirror. It was too quiet now, too still. She walked toward the mirror, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch it. The reflection was still hers, but it was wrong. Her face was pale, the skin stretched taut across her skull, and her eyes, those eyes were not hers anymore. They were dark, hollow, empty, and then her reflection smiled. The smile wasn't her own. It stretched unnaturally wide, a grotesque mockery of her own. And in the reflection, the woman's hands began to raise, mirroring Sophie's own, but the fingers were too long, the movements too fluid, too inhuman. The smile never wavered, never stopped growing. Sophie's body froze, the mirror pulling her in once again. The woman whispered, her voice rasping from the glass. "You looked into the past, Sophie, and now you belong to it." Sophie stumbled backward, her mind spinning, but she knew it was too late. The mirror had taken her, and now it was waiting for her to join the rest of its lost souls. And the worst part? The mirror had already claimed the next victim. That was tonight's chilling tale from Dr. Conjuring's channel. If it sent shivers down your spine, please give us a like. It's completely free and helps us share these eerie stories with more brave souls like you. And if you're craving even more bone-chilling horror that will haunt your nights, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You'll never miss a new upload, each story more terrifying than the last, delivered straight to your inbox. Thank you so much for listening. We truly appreciate every one of you. Good night. And remember, sleep with one eye open. You never know what might be watching. Ha ha.